Lord, make our ears attentive to your wisdom and incline our hearts to understanding. We cry out for insight and raise our voices for understanding. Surely if we seek it like silver and search for it like treasure, we will find the knowledge of God. Amen. Our reading today comes from the second book of Samuel. I'm not going to read the whole reading that I put in there. That's like 2 whole chapters. That would take a while. So I am going to read 11, 1 through 17, and then I'm going to jump to 12, 1 through 7. I put that whole thing in there because that's the whole story. Like, I'm going to be talking about the whole story, and it's one that I'm guessing most of you have heard. And if you haven't, you should be very angry with your previous clergy, because there's no way you should have not managed to hear this story. But I'm just doing a couple highlights. I'll reference the rest. If you want to read all the rest of it, there you go. So, 2 Samuel, starting with chapter 11, verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to do battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he laid with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence, and made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. In the morning David wrote a letter to Joab, and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, so he may be struck down and die." As Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to a place where he knew there were valiant warriors. The men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. So I'm going to back up to 11:27 before I start to 12:1. When her mourning was over, David sent and brought her, Bathsheba, into his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, "There were 2 men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat off his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guests who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity." Nathan said to David, "You are the man." I know it's a lot of reading, but you have to get at least most of the story. I'm guessing everyone has heard this before, at least some fraction of the story before, David and Bathsheba. It's a pretty popular story of kind of David's failings as an individual. The Bible talks up David a lot as being a great king and leader and a man after God's own heart. So then they throw in this story to be like, okay, he had some rough edges, right? He did some not so great stuff too. Just like Saul fell out of favor, after this event, David begins to fall out of favor a bit with God. And it gets messy. So, I think it's interesting. And what we're going to kind of talk about here is, despite the fact that David is praised throughout Scripture, throughout the Psalms, throughout the prophets, into the New Testament, right? The stories about his life recorded in 1st and 2nd Samuel, in these texts, paint a pretty dark picture of who this person is. This is a king who takes what he wants when he wants it. Now, he sees Bathsheba. He's up on his roof. Flat top roofs. This is an area that doesn't get a ton of rain, right? So people use their rooftops for stuff. And he sees her, presumably his house is up on a hill, because he's the king, so he can look down over his city, and he sees her bathing on her rooftop, which was normal. And I want to emphasize normal in that not only is it normal for them to bathe on the rooftop, but public nudity was really normal in the ancient world. Nobody batted an eye at that. That was really common. That's not a standout part from this story. That's an everyday thing. And he's like, ooh, that, like so many other things I've liked, should be mine. So he sends down a messenger to figure out who that lady is. And he comes back, oh, it's the daughter of Eliam. And her husband is Uriah, a Hittite. The Hittites are people from north a ways, up just north of Syria. At this time, they would have been headquartered out of a place called Carchemish, which is sort of like just into Turkey from Syria, if you're looking that part of the world today. The Hittites had a really big empire, and then that kind of collapsed, and they were down to just a few territories. Man, someday I really should do a whole sermon on the influence of the Hittites. Not today. Okay. This is one of the longest sets of notes I've had for a sermon, but I'm going to try really hard to keep this short, because I know we have a timeline, okay? Her husband is a Hittite named Uriah, which I also think is interesting, because the stories of David feature a lot of non-Israelites, right? Non-Hebrew. The last time I was here, at the beginning of the month, David finds out that Saul was killed by an Amorite, right? Like not a Hebrew, not one of his army, but this guy from the people they're literally fighting at that moment, who just happens to be with his soldiers instead of on the opposing side. And here he finds this person who is the wife of a Hittite. Very multinational kind of group that David seems to be leading. So he lays with her, and she conceives, and he's like, oh, yeah, this is going to be a problem. So he sends for her husband, which had to be a very odd experience for some random guy in the army, right? The commander, the general, gets the call up from the king, hey, send this random guy. I want to talk to him. So he sends Uriah back. And the king's like, so how's it all going? Right? I have to imagine Uriah's like, isn't this what Joab is for? Like, isn't this what the
commanders are for? You could have called, I don't know, it goes fine, I guess. All right, well, go home and wash your feet, he says. I can't not do this. Feet doesn't mean feet most of the time, all right? In places, there's angels, right, with 6 wings. And with 2, they cover their face. And with 2, they fly. And with 2, they cover their feet. Feet is a Hebrew word that has a very specific meaning, and it's not feet, okay? This is a popular, so wash your feet has nothing to do with his boots are dirty, okay? I love, this stuff is in the Bible. I don't know why we think it's like Shakespeare, you know? Shakespeare is so dirty at times, but it's just, there's like a language barrier, I think, so we don't get it. Anyways, go home and wash your feet, he says. But he doesn't do that. He hangs out by the palace, and the next morning, David goes, you had a long journey, why aren't you going home? Everybody's still out in the field fighting. I don't belong here. I belong out with them. I'm not going to go and be comfortable and do stuff when they're out suffering in the field. That's not right. David probably had a little pause there. Yep, that's okay. Well, I'll stay another day and I'll send you back. Gets him drunk. He doesn't go. So finally, he sends a letter by the hand of Uriah. Uriah, who can't read, remember, tiny fraction of the population can read and write. So Uriah, even if he had opened the letter, probably would not have been able to read it. He has Uriah bring a letter to Joab that says, this guy, put him in the front and make sure he dies. So Joab puts him in a group in the front. They make their way close to the city that they're assaulting. And then the rest of the troops pull back. So Uriah and the people fighting with him get killed. And then they send a letter back to King David saying, Uriah and several other people died. And the king's like, don't feel bad about it. It happens. That's war. Just finish taking the city now. So then Nathan comes. Nathan is a prophet. He doesn't get his own book. Sorry. I missed it. I backed up that little spot. After Uriah dies, of course, Bathsheba finds out, and she does her formal mourning period. And David waits until she ends that prescribed period and then goes, okay, you're with me now. And she enters the house as his man. I'd have to check. He has at least 5 wives at this point. I don't remember exactly. The numbers change depending on which book you're reading, on how many total he has. But she joins the royal household and has a son. Nathan, the prophet, hears from God, hey, David did some shady stuff. You should definitely go call him out on that. So Nathan, who doesn't get his own book, but he shows up a few times here in Samuel, comes and tells this story about the rich man who decided he didn't want to, use his own flock, so he steals the one lamb this poor guy has to give. And David's so angry. The man should die. That's so terrible. And Nathan's like, the rest of the chapter is Nathan basically telling David, look, God gave you everything. Everything you wanted. You're the king. You have wives. You have flocks. You have territory. You have an army. And if you needed more, I could have given you more too. And instead, you took this one guy's wife randomly against, and had him killed. This is terrible. Why would you do something like this? You're going to die. Is the short version. You are never going to, he says all kinds of terrible things, but you're never going to know peace. You're going to be killed. Your wives are all going to go to other households. Your line's done. And David just says, yeah, I did it. And the prophet's like, oh, okay, well, since you confessed to it, I guess you're not going to die. We'll just kill the child that you conceived with Bathsheba. That seems fair. So the child dies. Lingers for a few days and then dies. And David kind of mourns while the child is dying, but then as soon as the kid dies, he goes back to normal, and everyone around him's like, Aren't you, there's an expected mourning period, like this doesn't bother you? He goes, already did it, saw it coming, whatever. The end. That's David and Bathsheba. David is utterly uninterested in the agency of anyone around him. It just doesn't matter. What he wants, he gets. And that's a trend. That's not just in this story. This story always gets pulled out as this unique event for David where he did something terrible, but it's not unique. It is a pattern to him. Now, and you see that not just before this, but after this. So Bathsheba has another child, a relatively famous one, Solomon, who becomes the king after David, right? Solomon was beloved by God. There's this repeating thing of, oh, this guy's great, until he's in power, and then suddenly, hey, that was a bad idea. Solomon has the same thing that David had, that Saul had. But Solomon, by the way, the one who builds the temple, big deal in Jerusalem. But David, after this point, never really knows peace for the rest of his reign. It's not long after this that one of his sons rapes one of his daughters by a different one of his wives, and that causes a bunch of family infighting. And then one of his other sons kills some people and steals the throne from David. David actually ends up having to escape his own capital city and come back later after his son has been killed in battle to reclaim his own throne. And then when he reclaims his throne, there's a rebellion in the north because, well, obviously David isn't managing his household well, or probably the rest of his country. So you get a rebellion in the north that he has to crush. And then not long after that, there's a huge famine and then a nasty disease outbreak that wipes people out. When Solomon takes the throne, by deceit, by the way, there's a whole story in there about that, how Solomon tricks David into making him, Solomon with the help of Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan, tricks David into making him his heir instead of one of his other sons. Solomon takes the throne and executes his remaining brothers, right, to make sure none of them can challenge him for the throne, along with many of David's other servants. I believe Joab is one of them, the general in this story. Solomon has him executed. It doesn't end. It becomes a mess. And it is just David doing one terrible, foolish thing after another. And there's plenty of terrible stories before this, but I can't go into all of them. I don't have time to read the entirety of 2 books. So, this does not feel, the stories do not feel like the story of a righteous man after God's own heart to me. I can't read this or what comes after it or most of what comes before it and go, yeah, that's the good guy. You know, I can't see it. It feels very much like the praise of David, both in some of these texts here and later, is apologetic. It's just he won and he survived, and we name ourselves after his line, so we got to make him sound good, right? It feels so hacked in there like that most of the time. David was flat out a brutal, opportunistic warlord who was a terrible husband to several wives, of which we have stories of how terrible he was to them. He was a pretty terrible father, as evidenced by all of the horrible things that happened between him and his children, and then afterwards. And that's what we get of his life. But in the end, he won. His dynasty survived, bearing his name. When Israel in the north was destroyed, Judah remained. And the ruling family of Judah claimed their lineage from David all the way down. And even after Judah was destroyed and they went into exile, they came back. They won. So the people putting these texts together, the priests in the temple collecting all these texts, can only look at it and say, for all of this, God had to be on his side. How else can we make sense of everything that has happened? Why does any of this matter to us today? Right? We are not baptized in David's name. This figure is in the text, is an important character, but that's not who's on the stained glass windows. This wasn't even invented, right, at the time that David was king. That wasn't an execution method. Why does it matter? We have to come to terms somehow with David theologically. He's just too important in the tradition, in the text, to ignore. It's not, we can't just cut him out and have the rest of this make sense, because it doesn't. So we have to deal with him theologically. He's part of Jesus' lineage. It is shortly after this, right, that he's promised by God that it's his descendants that will be, the great Messiah to protect their people and raise up and do things. And it matters for how we read these texts about him and about these other characters. And I think we're left with four options for what we do with David. Either, one, God was okay with all the stuff that David did, except the couple of things that are pointed out as being very clearly wrong. Clearly God's not a fan of David and Bathsheba thing. That's pointed out. There's later on where David takes a census of his population, and for some reason God really gets mad about that. So apparently that was a no-go. It's a weird story. Towards the end, followed by a plague, David takes a census to see how many people he has, and then God's like, well, we're just going to kill a whole bunch of them then, so your numbers are wrong again. It's so out there. So either God is just okay with all this terrible stuff that David does. I can't handle that. That is if that is the image of God, if Jesus is who we look to understand who God is and what God desires and what matters to God, God cannot be okay with a lot of the stuff that David pulls. It just can't. I can't accept that one. Lots of people do. I can't. Two, another option, God just doesn't really care about a lot of these deeds. David's heart was somehow in the right place. David was really committed to God. This gets popular in some of the whole, we're saved by faith, not by works, and that's fine. But if you take that to an extreme, that's I say the right words, and God forgives everything, and I'm okay, and it doesn't matter what I do with everything else kind of mentality. I can't handle that. Once again, Jesus seems to care a lot about what we do with our lives and how we treat other people and what we do with our life while we have the opportunity to do things with it. Jesus seems to imply is a reflection on what we actually have inside. So I at least can't accept that God is unconcerned with these actions so long as David does them in a dedicated and faithful way. I can't handle it. Number three, definitely an option, though a really unsatisfying one. Only the bad stuff was recorded. Right? Imagine he was a fantastic king who did all kinds of wonderful things. And we have a couple good things in there that are pointed out as being really good and are fine. But the only things that ended up making their way into the text permanently were all the bad stuff. All right? I can't say that's not it. right? Because we deal with that problem today, right? You hear all kinds of terrible things and none of the good things. And not that the good things necessarily outweigh or undo the bad things, but you don't get a full picture of someone if you only have everything they've done wrong. And it is very possible that what ended up making the interesting stories, the stories that got recorded and shared with us, were the stories of real questionable stuff. I have a hard time imagining that, considering how greatly he's praised, right? That when we're not talking about stories of his life, if he did all of these great things, and they're praising him for these great things, some of that has to show up in here, doesn't it? But there's so few stories of him doing unambiguously good things. Fourth option is that it's editorializing. Is that we have stories from this time of the things David did, which were, for their time, expected, if not terrible, right? Terrible things happened. That was the ancient world it was just sort of normalized to a point to some respect that it wasn't a concern back then the way we have come to believe it's a concern because of the values that we've taken since, from being shown a different vision of what God's interests are and concerns are. And so a lot of the things that really pump him up, that really make him into this great hero of faith, is editorializing. He won. His people survived and thrived when everything else around them was destroyed. And even after they were destroyed, they came back. And that never happens. None of the other groups that were destroyed came back. God's got to be on his side. That was the only explanation they had for it, and that's the explanation they give. And they don't have a lot of great stories to show it, but they're like, look, we have no other explanation. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer to anybody, but that's certainly a possible one. What I see David as, when I read 1 Samuel, well, where he shows up later in 1 Samuel, through 2 Samuel, David to me reads as a cautionary tale. He is a tale of someone who knows how to do the things they want to do, to put themselves first, to exert their will, and bathe it in the right kind of God-fearing language that people believe them. That's what David feels like to me, because everyone around him thinks he's amazing, and yet somehow every story about him is atrocious. And we know that. Look back at history and tell me that all of these historical figures who do terrible, terrible things in the name of Jesus, in the name of whichever religious figure they want, even in religious figures that are so dedicated to peace, but they baptize it in the name and suddenly we're just okay with it. David is a cautionary tale of that. And when it comes to us reading this, when it comes to, if you go home and look at this, and do it once in a while, it's a good idea. I'm a fan. You can find all kinds of horrible things in here. There are a lot of bad things that are biblical. Bad things that we shouldn't do. But we are not called to do things because they're biblical. We are called to do things because they're Christ-like. Not everything in here is Christ-like. Jesus doesn't quote from the stuff about genocide. There are places where genocide is ordered and conducted against people groups. Okay? Jesus doesn't quote from that stuff, does he? Jesus references stuff about David at times when he's traveling and eats the bread of the presence and does some stuff. because the Sabbath is made for man. It's kind of a weird, convoluted story. But you know what he doesn't reference? David and Bathsheba. There are all kinds of things in here that you should not look to as guides for your life, as a basis on which to determine your moral compass. Lots of it. And that's okay. We are not the people of the book. We are the people of the Spirit, of the living Jesus and the Holy Spirit bound together. Jesus literally just calls the Bible testimony. It is this that testifies to me. We are not called to be people we do not have to look at everything in here and say it's good. We don't have to. We are never burdened by that obligation, ever. We are called to, there are stories in here about Jesus, all kinds of them. There are teachings in here about Jesus, all kinds of them, that we have to look at and learn from. But the point is never the letter of the law. It's never the letter. It is the Spirit, which is why we are given the Spirit, why we are called to live in the Spirit, why we are called to be loving and compassionate and just. I see all kinds of that. Jesus exemplifies all that stuff. David does not. But that's okay. We are not baptized in David's name. Thank God. We are baptized in Jesus' name and called to live that kind of life. So, heroes of the past, not so heroic. Let's pick better ones. Amen.